The woman's hand left a smear of blood on his cabin door before she crumpled into the snow. Silas Crane stood in the doorway of his mountain homestead, lantern raised, staring down at the impossible sight. No one came this far up the Medicine Bow Range in November. The nearest settlement was 18 miles through terrain that broke horses and killed the unprepared. Yet here she lay, face down in 2 feet of fresh powder, her thin coat soaked through, her fingers still curled against the weathered timber, as if she'd used her last strength to knock. He didn't ask her name. He simply lifted her, light as kindling, trembling like a caught bird, and carried her inside. 3 days earlier, the woman had still been known as Mrs. Catherine Price, wife to Douglas Price, respected banker in the town of Stillwater. She'd worn silk dresses and hosted dinner parties and smiled until her face ached while her husband's grip left bruises shaped like his fingers on her arms. That morning, she'd woken to find him standing over the bed, his belt doubled in his fist. "You embarrassed me," Douglas said quietly. "At the mayor's house. Contradicted me in front of his wife." Catherine had learned years ago that explanations only made it worse. She'd pulled the quilt higher, bracing herself. But something in his eyes that morning was different. Colder. Final. "I've been patient with you," he continued. "But you don't learn." When he finally left for the bank, she'd counted to 1,000 before moving. Her hands shook as she pulled her winter coat from the wardrobe, stuffed bread and cheese into her pockets, took the small bundle of household money she'd been hiding for 2 years. $37. Everything she owned that he didn't control. She'd walked out the kitchen door without looking back. Stillwater sat in a valley surrounded by mountains. Catherine had no family, no close friends Douglas hadn't systematically isolated her from. But she remembered a conversation at one of those awful dinner parties, a trapper mentioning the high country, the old Crane place, miles from anywhere. The man who lived there alone. "Mean bastard," someone had said. "Threw a man through a window at the trading post for cheating at cards. Keeps to himself," another had added. "They say he came back from the war wrong. Nobody bothers him up there." Catherine had thought, a place nobody goes. A man nobody bothers. It had sounded like sanctuary. The climb had nearly killed her. The trail disappeared under snow after the first 5 miles. Her boots weren't made for this, city leather that let in water and cold. Twice she'd fallen, once sliding 20 feet down a ravine before catching herself on a juniper root. Her hands bled. Her lungs burned. The temperature dropped as the sun faded, and she'd known with crystalline certainty that she would die on this mountain. Then she'd seen the light. A single window, golden against the dark trees. Smoke rising from a stone chimney. She'd stumbled toward it like a woman drowning, swimming toward air. Now Silas Crane laid her on the bearskin rug before his fire and worked with the efficient calm of a man who'd tended worse injuries in worse conditions. He peeled off her frozen coat, her soaked dress, wrapped her in wool blankets, and checked her fingers and toes for frostbite. The blood on his door had come from her hands, torn and raw from her climb. He heated water, cleaned the wounds with steady hands scarred from a decade of mountain living. She stirred once, eyes fluttering open to see him bent over her, and she flinched so violently she nearly rolled into the fire. "Easy," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, but quiet. "You're safe." She stared at him, all beard and bulk and firelit shadow, and something in his absolute stillness made her believe him. She closed her eyes and let the darkness take her again. When she finally woke, it was to the smell of coffee and venison stew. Silas sat at his rough-hewn table, his back to her, eating in silence. The cabin was a single room, bed in one corner. Table and chairs near the fire, shelves lined with supplies, traps hanging from the rafters. Everything brutal and functional. Nothing soft except the furs and the firelight. She sat up slowly. The blankets fell to her waist. Someone had dressed her in a clean flannel shirt, his, clearly, hanging to her knees. He didn't turn around. "There's food. And coffee." Catherine's throat closed. She couldn't remember the last time a man had offered her something without expecting payment. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet." He stood, moving to the fire to pour coffee into a tin cup. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were the color of winter sky. Pale, cold, unreadable. "Storm's coming. Big one. You're stuck here until it passes. Could be a week. Could be more." She nodded, accepting the cup he handed her. Their fingers didn't touch. "I won't ask what you're running from," Silas said. and I won't send you back. But when the snow clears, you'll need a plan that's more than just up. Catherine wrapped both hands around the cup, feeling its warmth seep into her frozen fingers. Through the window, the first flakes of the new storm were already falling, thick and fast, erasing her trail, erasing everything behind her. I know, she whispered. What she didn't know was that in Stillwater, Douglas Price had already sent men after her, or that those men were closing in. The storm buried the mountain for 5 days straight. Snow piled against the cabin walls until the windows showed only white. Wind screamed through the pines like something living and furious. Inside, Catherine and Silas moved around each other in careful silence, two strangers learning the rhythms of shared space. He never asked her name. She never offered it. He called her ma'am, when he spoke at all, which wasn't often. She learned his routine quickly. Up before dawn to tend the fire, check the trap lines close to the cabin, split wood, melt snow for water. Everything done with the same economical precision. No wasted movement. No wasted words. She made herself useful because she couldn't bear to be a burden. She cupped the game he brought in, mended the tear in his spare shirt, organized the chaos of his shelves. When she found his collection of books, Shakespeare, Whitman, a water-stained copy of Plutarch, she looked at him differently. You read Greek philosophy, she said, not quite a question. Silas was sharpening his skinning knife by the fire. He didn't look up. War taught me that violence is easy. Thinking's harder. It was the most personal thing he'd said since she'd arrived. Catherine opened her mouth to ask more, but the look on his face stopped her. Some doors stayed closed for a reason. On the third night, she woke screaming. The nightmare had her back in Stillwater, in their bedroom, Douglas's hands around her throat. She came awake thrashing against the blankets, gasping for air that wouldn't come, and found Silas crouched beside the bearskin rug, hands raised where she could see them, not touching her. You're safe, he said, steady and sure. You're in the mountains. He's not here. She pressed both hands to her face, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Silas stayed exactly where he was, a solid presence in the dark, until her breathing slowed. I'm sorry, she whispered. Don't be. He stood. Move to the fire, added Wood. I know nightmares. They're honest, at least. Show you what you're really afraid of. Catherine pulled the blankets tighter. What are you afraid of? For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, going back to who I was. Before I came here. She understood. The mountain was his sanctuary too. The storm finally broke on the 6th day. Silas dug out the door and stepped into a world transformed. Everything buried. The forest silent except for the creak of snow-laden branches. He checked his trap lines and found wolf tracks circling the cabin. Fresh. The pack had been close during the storm. When he came back inside, the woman was at the table, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, staring at nothing. When the pass is clear, I'll take you to Fort Bridger, Silas said, hanging his coat. You can catch the stage from there. Go wherever you want. She didn't answer immediately. When she finally looked up, her eyes were raw. He'll find me. My husband. He has money, connections. He'll hire men to track me. And when they bring me back, her voice broke. He told me once that if I ever tried to leave, he'd make sure I never walked again. Silas went very still. He put his hands on you. It wasn't a question. She didn't need to answer. He moved to the window, looking out at the white expanse, his jaw tight. Catherine watched the tension coil through his broad shoulders, saw the way his scarred hands curled into fists. I won't go back, she said quietly. I'd rather freeze on this mountain than go back to that house. Silas turned to face her. In the firelight, his expression was unreadable. Then don't. I have nowhere else. Stay here. The words hung in the air between them. Catherine stared at him, certain she'd misheard. You don't even know my name. Don't need to. He crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. You want sanctuary, I'm offering it. Storms proved you can handle the isolation. You can cook. You're not afraid of work, and you don't fill the silence with nonsense. That's more than most. You can't just, people will talk. A woman living. With a man, unmarried, nobody comes up here. And the few who do know better than to question how I live. His pale eyes met hers. I'm offering you a choice. Real one. Not what some man decided for you. Catherine felt something crack open in her chest. Freedom. Actual freedom. It was terrifying and enormous, and she wanted it so badly she could taste it. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this? Silas was quiet for a moment. Because nobody gave me a choice when I needed one. And because any man who'd hurt a woman the way yours hurt you deserves to lose her. Before Catherine could respond, they heard it. Voices, distant but carrying clear in the cold air. Men, calling to each other through the trees. Coming closer. Silas moved to the window, his face hardening. Through the pines, she could see them. 4 riders, pushing through the deep snow, armed. Even at this distance, she recognized the gray horse in front. Douglas had sent his brother. And the county sheriff. Get away from the window, Silas said quietly. There was something in his voice now that raised the hair on Catherine's arms. Something cold and final. And don't come out unless I call for you. He pulled his rifle from above the door and checked the load with practiced efficiency. Then he stepped outside, closing the door behind him with a gentleness that somehow made the moment more frightening. Catherine pressed her face to the crack between the door and frame, her heart hammering, and watched the mountain man walk out to meet the armed riders with the calm of a man who had already decided exactly how far he was willing to go. Silas Crane stopped 30 feet from his cabin, the rifle held loose in one hand, pointing at the ground. The 4 riders pulled up, their horses blowing steam in the frozen air. The man on the gray horse had Douglas Price's same weak chin and calculating eyes. "You Crane," the sheriff called. He wore a badge and a confident smirk. "I am Sheriff Michaels, from Stillwater. This here's Martin Price. We're looking for his brother's wife. Catherine Price. Woman's not right in the head, ran off in the storm. Tracks led up this way before the snow covered them." The sheriff leaned forward in his saddle. "You seen her?" "No. Mind if we check your cabin?" "Yes." The sheriff's smirk faded. "That wasn't really a question, friend. And that wasn't really a request for help." Silas's voice stayed level, but something shifted in his posture. The rifle came up slightly, still not aimed, but ready. "You're on my land, 18 miles from your jurisdiction. You've got no warrant, no authority, and no business here." Martin Price pushed his horse forward. "Listen, you ignorant mountain trash." The rifle snapped up, barrel aimed directly at Martin's chest. The movement was so fast, so precise, that Martin's horse shied sideways, nearly throwing him. "Careful," Silas said softly. "I don't miss at this distance." The 3 men behind the sheriff reached for their guns. Silas didn't move. He stood like a boulder in the snow, the rifle rock steady. "You want to start something?" Silas asked. "Because I spent 4 years in the war getting real comfortable with killing. And I know these mountains in ways you never will. You might get me, but I'll drop at least 2 of you first, and the others won't make it off this mountain alive. Wolves are hungry this time of year." The cold certainty in his voice made it clear this wasn't a bluff. Sheriff Michaels raised a hand slowly. "Easy now. Nobody needs to die today. We're just looking for a missing woman. And I told you I haven't seen her." "Douglas Price is offering a substantial reward," Martin said, his voice shaking slightly. $500 for information. She's his wife. His property. Something changed in Silas's eyes. Something that made even the sheriff swallow hard. "She's not property," Silas said, each word sharp as a knife. "And if Douglas Price wants to come up here himself and look for her, he's welcome to try. But you 4 are leaving. Now." The standoff stretched. 4 armed men against 1. But that one man stood in front of his own door, on ground he knew, with nothing behind him worth less than the line he'd drawn. After a long moment, Sheriff Michaels turned his horse. "This isn't over, Crane." "Yes, it is." Silas's finger moved to the trigger. "Don't come back." They rode away slowly, Martin Price looking back twice before the trees swallowed them. Silas stood motionless until the sound of hooves faded completely. Then he lowered the rifle, his hands perfectly steady, and walked back to the cabin. Catherine stood just inside the door, tears streaming down her face. "You could have died. For me. And you don't even know my name." Silas set the rifle above the door. "Don't need to know your name to know you deserve better than what he gave you." She crossed the room in 3 steps and did something that shocked them both. She wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face against his chest. For a moment, Silas stood frozen, this massive man who'd just faced down 4 armed riders, completely undone by a simple embrace. Then his arms came up, slow and careful, and held her while she cried. "Catherine," she whispered against his shirt. "My name is Catherine. Catherine." He said it like he was testing the weight of it. "I'm Silas." She pulled back enough to look up at him. "What do we do now?" "They'll come back. Or Douglas will send others." Silas thought for a moment. his hand still resting on her shoulder. There's a trading post, 3 days east, run by a Shoshone family. They've got no love for Stillwater law, and they keep their mouths shut. We can get word to the territorial marshal about what your husband did. Get official protection. And until then, you stay here. With me. He met her eyes. If that's what you want. Catherine looked around the rough cabin. The bearskins and rifle, the books and firelight, the absolute safety of these walls. Then she looked at the man who'd given her something no one else ever had. A choice. It's what I want. Spring came to the Medicine Bow Range like a slow exhale. The snow retreated up the peaks, wildflowers exploded across the meadows, and Catherine learned to read the mountain the way Silas did, by the flight of birds, the tracks in mud, the shape of clouds over the high ridges. The territorial marshal had come in February, listened to Catherine's testimony, and issued a warrant for Douglas Price's arrest. It turned out Catherine wasn't his first wife. There'd been another, years ago, who'd disappeared under suspicious circumstances. With Catherine's evidence, the whole rot came to light. Douglas died in a jail cell before trial, his heart giving out. Catherine felt nothing when Silas told her. That man had died to her the moment she'd walked out his door. By May, the meadow behind Silas's cabin was cleared for a garden. Catherine planted potatoes and carrots, beans and squash. Silas built her a root cellar, and if his hands lingered on hers when he showed her the door latch, neither of them mentioned it. By July, the careful distance between them had worn down to something warmer. Silas taught her to shoot, to read weather, to move quiet through the forest. Catherine taught him to laugh again, to talk about the past without flinching, to trust that someone could stay without needing to own him. One evening in late summer, they sat on the porch he'd built, watching the sun paint the peaks gold. Catherine's hand rested on the weathered wood between them. Silas's hand covered it, his thumb tracing her healed scars. "I never thank you properly," she said, "for saving my life. You saved your own life." Silas squeezed her hand gently. "You walked 18 miles through a blizzard. That was all you. But you gave me a reason to survive it." He turned to look at her, this woman who'd collapsed at his door 6 months ago and changed everything. "Catherine Price. Catherine Crane," she corrected softly. "If you'll have me." Silas went very still. "You sure? Man like me. Rough, nothing fancy." She leaned over and kissed him, soft and sure, tasting coffee and mountain air and home. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. "I'm sure. The question is, are you?" Silas looked at her like she'd given him something precious beyond measure. He stood, pulled her to her feet, and kissed her properly, deep and claiming and full of promise. "I'm sure," he whispered against her lips. They married at the trading post, with the Shoshone elder officiating and the mountains bearing witness. No one from Stillwater came. No one from Catherine's old life. Just a man and a woman who'd both been broken by the world and found each other in the wild places where broken things learn to heal. Years later, when travelers asked how Catherine Crane ended up on a mountain with the infamous Silas Crane, she'd smile and say, "I got lost in a storm, and he showed me the way home." She never mentioned that the storm wasn't weather, or that home wasn't a place she'd found, but a man who'd never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. And Silas, when asked the same question, would look at his wife, strong and steady, garden dirt under her nails, rifle on her shoulder, and say simply, "She knocked. I answered. Some doors, once opened, change everything."